Charlie Hayes says, related to cooking, I've seen a lot of people compare cooking to art and baking to chemistry. Is that an analogy you agree with? Additionally, between cooking and baking, do you find one intuitively easier than the other? Oh, right. So I wrote out a bunch of stuff around this question because the whole idea about cooking on the stove being an art and baking being a science is it's a moderately reasonable description, but it is desperately incomplete. I think for those who are uncomfortable in the kitchen, baking recipes in general are built with a higher rigor than normal, like stovetop and oven recipes. I will elaborate. For the uninitiated about cookbooks and cooking, a whole bunch of cookbooks out there are shite. The recipes are approximate. They were not rigorously tested. The timings of stuff is often way off the mark. The number of times I have cracked a recipe and it said, cook the onions until they're blah, blah, blah. It should take 5 or 6 minutes. And it's like, no, that's not going to take 5 or 6 minutes. This many onions on a frying pan, it's going to take like 15 minutes to get the result that you want there. So just know that a lot of recipe books for non-baking recipes can be terrible. They can be phoned in. They're often untested. But I'm not going to abandon you there with just that piece of information. I want to tell you there are some cookbooks that are surpassingly accurate and are fantastic for, So the reason I bring that up is because if you don't know a kitchen very well, you're going to have a higher reward from cooking a baking recipe, I think, than something in the frying pan, simply because it's been built with more rigor. Now, there are cookbooks with plenty of rigor. The first one I remember cooking from is Doña Tomas. It's a restaurant over in Oakland, Donathomas. Fantastic Mexican restaurant, and their cookbook about Mexican cooking is stunning. Everything I have cooked from that cookbook and that we have cooked as a family from that cookbook has come out phenomenally. So I love Doña Tomas. Thomas Keller's cookbooks are also phenomenal. They are spectacular. Be warned, Keller often has like, do this, and as a side note, and there's like a whole day's long recipe to do this extra addition to your salad. There's a lot of steps. But you're going to be steered correctly by Keller. And Keller often talks about why you're cutting things to this size. It's the philosophical stuff that comes out in Keller recipes is terrific. I think one of the best recipe groups, and again, my knowledge of this isn't as complete as my wife. She is the much more frequent cook in our house, but Ottolenghi, Otolennghi, the Ottolenghi group has a set of cookbooks. I think their most famous one is Plenty, and there's plenty more. There's a sequel. Plenty is a cookbook that it's almost always on the counter in our house. We cook from it constantly. And really, really well-written recipes, really, really nicely done. I think that there are aspects to baking which is more comforting to people who are, let's say, are of a more scientific bent, again, because the values are carefully elucidated. But I also see that problem is solved when Keller says to me in a recipe, cut these the same size. They'll all cook the same if you do that. Separate out your mushrooms before cooking them in batches, and the color will be better when you join them all together. A lot of Keller is explaining to you why cooking this way leads to a better presentation, which means you don't necessarily have to do it if you don't care about presentation, you just want to eat. So while the delineation of cooking being art and baking being science is, again, moderately useful delineation, I think that it tends to sequester too many people where someone says, oh, I bake a lot, and somebody else is like, oh, I wonder how creative that is. I don't like it. You're one notch away from that description and some interesting and boring gatekeeping. I have done both baking and lots of cooking. I like both. I mean, every time you put cookie dough in the oven, it's a magic trick to me. I never tire of that. But in cooking, I like the spongier targets. Like, can you make this taste better? What does this need? I love those questions. And then somebody else asked, Peckenstein says, thing one and thing two, my sons are makers in their own right, but outside of cooking, do you have projects you've worked on with them in your own makerspace? Yeah. I find anytime I get to share my passion with my son or share in his, it is always a delight. This is 100% true. Some of the most fun I've had in the last 10 years has been cooking with my kids. Cooking in our kitchen, we have a lovely, lovely, well-outfitted kitchen. And it's a delight to move around in and to cook with other people in. And my sons are, I mean, that's the kitchen they grew up in. So they know it intimately and it's delightful. I did do one project with Thing One when he was in grade school. He had to build a trebuchet and I said I would help him. And my preparation for helping him build a trebuchet was I did no research on it whatsoever. It may surprise you to learn that I didn't build a trebuchet until I think the last season of Mythbusters. Mm-hmm. And it just never come up. I understand the mechanics of how a trebuchet worked, but the one thing that I didn't know was just how a trebuchet releases its load. I understood that, it pulls it and you get this centrifugal moment that it hurls it at this proper apex, but how does it know? How does it release at that apex of the centrifugal force? And so my son and I, we sat here right over there and we basically spent about 3 hours putting together the parts of a trebuchet. And then it came time to the loop that's at the end that goes to the arm. Okay, so we put the loop and there's a screw there. And we're like, all right, well, I think the hook should be like this. We both were like, what should the hook be? It should be like this. And we put the loop around the hook. And the trebuchet takes the first thing we have, which is like this little it's a cluster of actually ball bearings is what we did because we wanted a heavy weight. And it takes it and it goes whack right on the ground. And we're like, that's not right. Okay, so then we're like, maybe we make the hook a little more open. And I think at this point, he's like 11 or 12. It's like a fun age to play around with this kind of ideation. And we're like, okay, let's make the hook like this. And we unbend it a little bit. We set it up again and we launch it. And again, it goes whack right into the ground, except about 2 feet farther away from the trebuchet than the first test. And I look at that and I think, wait a minute, I'll bet that the proper orientation of the hook is straight up and that when it slips off, it is by definition at the apex of its, and I looked over and my son was having precisely the same thought, perhaps with different terminology, but we both were like, oh, and we both, I think almost simultaneously said, the hook has to be straight. And we did it and we launched that thing into my loading door over here, like 60 feet away. It was absolutely spectacular. One of my favorite parenting moments I ever experienced. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support us even further, you can by becoming a tested member. Details are, of course, below, but it includes all sorts of perks, and we're building them all the time. You get advanced word and behind-the-scenes photos of some of our projects. Questions, you get to ask direct questions during my live streams, and we have some members-only videos, including the Adam real-time series of unbroken, unedited shots of me working here in the shop. They are weirdly meditative. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you on the next one.